All right, and today I will be talking about my companion in massive jet lag. Interesting coincidence to be talking about this particular book because on my flight back, the 13-hour flight back that I was on from Taipei, because I had a layover there, I watched Argo, which I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction, and one of the reasons that I'm not a fan of historical fiction comes down to the fact that historical fiction tends to omit certain key details or fictionalize things in a way that changes the nuance subtly. And the problem with those kinds of subtle changes is that it can miscast sort of your understanding of that incident. And I can enjoy historical fiction as its own thing, which kind of spoilers, I really enjoyed Argo, and I actually really enjoyed, not really enjoyed, but I enjoyed the director. But in both cases, I think that there are elements where the adaptation really leaves a lot out of it. And I am kind of mixed because on the one hand, if I hadn't read about, or I hadn't watched Argo, I would have never known about that particular operation, and I would not have known, or I would not have had the impetus to go and look it up and educate myself on it. And at the same time, with the director, there's actually an author's note at the back that I really appreciate. That while brief, does go a little bit into some of the recognition of elements which are entirely the author's own creation. That in fact the main character, or the focus of the novel, has a son in the book who doesn't even exist in real life. And it's those kinds of elements that just sort of frustrate me with historical fiction, because on the one hand, like I said, they can draw attention to events and situations which otherwise might not have gotten the attention that they deserve, and unto themselves can be very enjoyable stories. But at the same time, from a historical perspective, the fact that like Argo does cut out so many of Canada's side of the story and so much of what they did to help the U.S. They weren't representatives, State Department employees, and that in real life they actually went to some other embassies, like was it Sweden or Switzerland? And they even stayed at the English embassy for a day. So there was a lot more to that event. It was a lot more complex than the movie portrays. And with the director, because there is a lot of it that is lost media, the author does take a lot of liberties. And I don't fault him for doing that. Like I said, it draws attention to something that I think is really fascinating. But it does become problematic when people start to take historical fiction and mistake it for historical truth. And that, I think, can be a dangerous thing. But that said, with that little preamble out of the way, why did I pick up the director? I actually read a review on it, and I cannot remember where I read it, and I cannot remember the author, which is a pity, because it was the first time that I had read a book review from, probably not the first time, but one of the first times that I read a book review from an actual literary magazine, where the review itself probably would have printed out to about 7 to 10 pages. Very in-depth, very detailed, with a lot of commentary and analysis. And the thing is, I knew as I was reading this review that I wouldn't remember much of it by the time I actually got around to reading the book, which is true because it took me almost a year to finally get around to it. And but that said, that really whetted my appetite for the book, because one of the things that I talk about a lot is I don't like war stories. I'm tired of war stories. So it takes a lot for me to become interested in a story set around war, much less World War II. It's just something covered so often and so done to death. But this idea, talking about not just the propaganda machine, because I've read, and watched some stuff on that, which it's interesting, don't get me wrong, but again, it's just kind of well-trod ground. But specifically to explore it through the primary theme of the story, which you've seen repeated, I should say, if you know anything about the book, you will have seen repeated a lot, is these sort of subtle compromises in the way that we gradually come to accept the oppression and actually become complicit in it. So, which I think is a really interesting topic. And it must be said, I read an article by the Translator, whom the book came out in Germany. I should say the Translator translated by Ross Benjamin. We're talking about the director by Daniel Kehlmann, probably, translated by Ross Benjamin. And I read an article by Ross Benjamin in which Ross Benjamin talked about how the book came out in Germany in 2023. It then became he translated it in 2024. And during that time, Trump was elected, and a lot of things changed. And the book came out in 2025, and the nature of the commentary of the book became a lot more relevant in ways that obviously weren't intended at the time, but has certainly caused the book to resonate in a very different way than it would have had it come out in 2023. I usually say that I try not to get political on this channel, but there are some just undeniable facts and a lot of the parallels between the gradual acquiescence of certain, the surrender of certain rights, and the acceptance of the treatment of certain people and the way you gradually shift towards that certainly have, while not one-to-one, parallels in today's society. So it definitely hits differently reading it in Trump's America, but it's also, I think, important to remember that this was written actually before Trump's America in Germany, or it could be Austria, by a German-Austrian writer. So while, as I think anybody in America will approach this book and see it through that lens, I do think it's important to point out that it sort of predates that, and that is certainly a lens to see it from. So to get into a bit about what the book is about, the book follows... Okay, the primary focal point of the book is H.G. Pabst, which to me, the name Pabst, I cannot get it out of my head in association with Pabst Blue Ribbon, but who was a director, an Austrian director, who was a real person. But the reason that I say that it's sort of the central character and not that it's about him or it follows him, it's about him, but it doesn't always follow him, because the structure of the book is constantly sort of shifting between, sometimes it's bookended by two first-person accounts. There's another first-person account in the center, but otherwise who you're following shifts pretty radically between chapters and the segments, and even some of the style can shift between these chapters and segments from longer, more descriptive paragraphs to sometimes extremely heavy dialogue scenes. Sometimes a chapter can be very surrealistic in its presentation, almost magical realist and mythical. Other times it's extremely grounded and impactful. Well, not impactful. Impactful suggests that the other isn't, but sort of very grounded and realistic. So in that, and you're not always, while Pabst is the central figure, you're not always in his head. And between chapters, time can leap pretty substantially. So it feels to me, and maybe somebody will agree, but it feels to me best approached as a sort of sequence of episodes that follow H.D. Pabst. Firstly, he has already fled. The start of the book, he's already fled from America from Austria into America, and then you sort of gradually build up why he goes back to Austria, and then the rest of the book is concerned with his filmmaking in Austria. But, and this is a sort of key point, especially given the way that this book is portrayed to a lot of people, this is not a deep character study type story, despite in many ways sort of giving that air. And like I said, despite being described in many ways like that, you're never fully aware of Pap's psyche. You're never really deep into his head. You kind of just get these snapshots of whether or not it's from his perspective, whether or not it's from his wife's perspective, whether or not at one point it's from a certain British writer's perspective. You're never really fully in his head. It's each chapter kind of follows a slightly different structure, a slightly different perspective character. So you're sort of seeing him from the outside. Which, if we're talking about the book in the context of pros and cons, that's a really interesting place to start. Because personally, and I've said this before, I like characters, more psychological books that really delve deep into a character's psyche. It's why I tend to not gel so well with saga stories that tell a more macro focus. So in that sense, obviously my preference is more to have more psychological insights into Pabst. But at the same time, the reason that I'm not willing to call this a negative, the reason that I'm not saying that I think that this is how it should be or whatever, is because there is a lot to be said for making the reader work to recognize the subtle ways in which Pabst gradually becomes complicit and accepting of the regime that he's in. So it's a very stark contrast between something like Hard Like Water, where you had the psychological profile, you were in that guy's head the whole time, and it made it hard to read because he was such a believer. This is sort of, it's not the same, but it's sort of similar in the sense that you have a sort of political oppressive regime and somebody who gradually comes to accept it, but you're just seeing it from the outside. And in that interview that I mentioned earlier with the author, or with the translator, Ross Benjamin, he mentions a lot of them, which is why I'm just going to mention some of the ones that he mentions rather than sort of go into all of it. But early on, Pabst will hesitantly lift up his arm in the Hitler salute, whereas later in the book, it's described as being an automatic process. His relationship with using victims in concentration camps as extras is something he struggles with quite a lot early on, but after a certain point, he's so fixated that he no longer sees a moral problem with this. And again, you don't get that in his head. You never get, and this is where I think that there's a certain brilliance to the book. One thing that the book does really, really well, that is, I would say, is absolutely a pro, is there is never a turning point where just bam, he's a dick now. There's never that one decision where you go, oh no, he's actually a bad guy, or oh, this is the moment when you sold yourself. I'm trying to think of an example from a movie, and I just can't. There's no Anakin Skywalker kills Count Dooku moment or whatever. I don't fucking know. Anyway, and I think that that's really more accurate to life. And in terms of going about exploring the theme of the book, appreciating that most people don't have a singular moment where they suddenly become indoctrinated. Tends to have a cultish connotation to it, but most people don't have that sort of moment where it's like, oh, I feel uncomfortable about this, but I guess I'm going this way and I'm evil now, or not necessarily evil, but I guess this is my association now. This is how I affiliate. This is what I believe. It tends to be a more gradual sense of giving in a little bit and then 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 a little bit until you have convinced yourself mentally that you're still a good person despite the fact that you have surrendered so many of the things that you, or not even surrendered, but compromised on so many of your values. Values that you would have thought core and central to your being, but which, and he never is, but which I think anybody would then be forced to reckon with asking themselves whether or not those values really were that core to their being, or whether or not their being is really something else. And the way that the book handles that is really excellent. Another point that I want to give credit to with this book is the way that it is constantly reinventing itself. I think one of the quotes mentions it being a page turner, and it is. It's a very easy read. Like I said, I'm totally jet lagged, been totally jet lagged for the past several days, and I've nonetheless been able to read through this book pretty easily because of the earlier I mentioned semi-episodic structure, where it is constantly reinventing itself, not in any major ways. This isn't like it suddenly becomes a new book with each chapter type of thing, but it just constantly, you never get sort of bored. Bored feels so strong, but you're just constantly being intellectually stimulated. God, it just, let's just keep it with a nice way. It manages to keep finding ways to recapture the reader's attention by constantly sort of reinventing or shifting the angle or perspective of the story. The only sort of detriment to that, and this is where I would come in a bit on the con angle, is, again, the characters. Pabst is the one that gets a lot of the focus, and I already said that there's a benefit to the way that the book describes Pabst without necessarily giving us his deep psychological insights and profiles. Fair enough. But there are other characters that, given the nature of the book, will appear in the book, and at the same time, while you can sort of get a sense of who they are and how they act, they very much just kind of come and go, and or just hang around in the background, and you never quite get to see their journey or their quest, which unto itself, okay, let's say that this story was just following Pabst, and it was, it could be first person, third person, but third person limited following Pabst. At that point, you could understand why some of these characters don't feel quite as fleshed out as they could, because the story is following Pabst. So if Pabst isn't in this place at this time, then it wouldn't matter. But if Pabst, but given that the story is very freely changing perspectives, it leads to certain events and certain characters feeling underbaked in a way which, at least to me, felt unsatisfying. So to give an example, the wife joins a book club at a certain point in the story, and you get the scene from the book club, and thematically the book club sort of serves its purpose in sort of demonstrating how, from the wife's angle, they have to sort of react and how they sort of are behaving under German Nazi control. So, like, fine, it has served its functional thematic purpose. But, and it does kind of show up again later on in the sense that this is how he ends up getting the rights to direct a certain movie. But it also kind of just falls by the wayside. And I would have liked to have seen more, in the sense that I would have liked to have seen how other people sort of shift their perspectives as things go on. I think there was an opportunity there, from my perspective, to have sort of Pabst the husband and how he talks and engages with the film side of art and culture under this Reich propaganda. But then there was an opportunity to have his wife, Gertrude, and her perspective, and how she, being much more resistant to it than her husband, sort of copes and navigates between this group of women in the reading club. And the thing is, typically I don't like to criticize something for not being what I wanted it to be. But in this instance, what I'm criticizing is the fact that it feels like it has this element, like it sets something up, but it doesn't do enough with it. It doesn't do much with it. It just kind of does the bare minimum. And for every character who's not Pabst, that ends up feeling like a lot of what the story does is it takes the time to set up these certain elements and details and then doesn't really do enough with them. Or I just wish that it did more with them, I guess is really a better way of saying it. Like, I just wish that there was more there. It just felt very lacking for how much effort went into setting things up. Another thing that I would kind of count as a con, it's a mixture of a con and a neutral, which is the book relies in certain cases on you knowing and understanding the historical context of certain things, because certain characters aren't mentioned by name, despite the fact that they appear in a scene. And you are just kind of sort of expected to know who they are. There's a certain English writer, I'm forgetting his name now, who was doing propaganda for the Nazis because he was in France, I guess, and got captured when France fell, and he was doing propaganda broadcasts for the Nazis. And he's never mentioned by name, despite the fact that not only is he established at an earlier point in the story, but he has, aside from the book-ending first chapter and last chapter, the only other first-person chapter in the story. So in that sense, he's a very emotionally, to like sort of the emotional resonation of the book, significant character. And yet at the same time, he's never even named. It's just kind of expected that you understand historically who this person is. It's, the book is kind of just nudging you because nobody ever says his name. Nobody ever says, "Oh, how's it going, guy?" It's always just you or the English or, "Oh, I'm aware of your books," and blah, blah, blah. Oh, this when he meets with another author, it's like, oh, I've read your books, but I despise them. Oh, well, thank you, very nice, whatever. Like, it's never like, oh, this is so-and-so. So in that sense, it's just, it's the dichotomy of, like, if you know, and I appreciate the fact that the book doesn't sort of beat you over the heads with these things and leaves it up to you to fill in the blanks. But the sort of flip side of that, and this kind of gets combined with another thing that I found a bit irksome, towards the end of the book, and some of and this just gets into fictional, historical fiction, the emotional things going on towards the end of the book with his last film and that he records under the Reich and everything associated with that. Because the film is lost media, from what I've researched and what has been said, there are no details about the filming of that. So what happens in the book, despite it being the emotional linchpin to this whole story, to being the point that really emphasizes just how much he has fallen, it is pure fiction. So at the same time that the book clearly expects you to have a certain knowledge of World War II and the historical figures associated with it and some of their roles and their behaviors, it also plays with fiction or plays with history in a way which perhaps somebody who is incredibly aware of it or does do the research might find a bit irksome or taking too many liberties. And that's sort of the balancing act with any type of historical fiction. I mean, even down to giving Pabst a son changes things substantially from history, much less the parallels that son shows to Hitler, being both an inspiring painter and yet at the same time somebody very caught up in nationalistic zeal. So what does it add to the story? What does it take away from the story? How much do you sort of feel or believe in that whole concept of, the based on a true story, this whole based on how far you feel like extending liberties to that, which frankly seems to be a lot of people. The book seems to be incredibly popular, and I understand why. Particularly, again, I don't think I need to go into themes, because I think in talking about pros and cons, I've made some of the themes very clear. The only thing that I would really talk about thematically beyond what I've already said, and this is where some of the liberties sort of come in, is the sort of subtle impact that what Pabst does impacts his relationship with his family. Watching his son fall for the propaganda machine that he's a part of, and his sort of estrangement from his wife. But again, because this isn't a deep psychological delve into him, you never fully get his reaction to that, his sort of, you never get the full weight of it, because you're always just sort of seeing his reactions to things, rather than getting into his thought process, getting into understanding, okay, he's sad for his son, but he still wants to make his movie. You can kind of infer that it's because he believes in art. And I guess that's the other thing that I didn't mention. The sort of nature of art and the role of art in a time of warfare, which I think also really ties back to a lot of Roberto Bolaño's work, in the questioning of what the limitations of art are. And the book certainly asks the question of what ends justify the means. Do the ends justify the means? And again, I'm not going to challenge the book, but one of the things that I definitely thought when writing the book, somebody asks Pabst at one point in the story, is now the time to be making art? And his response is like, when all this is over, the art is the only thing that's going to have mattered. And I think if you really wanted to interrogate that idea further, and this is where sometimes I talk about interrogating themes, my thought was, is it a question of, is now the time to make art? Or is it a question really, and I kind of wish the book had gone into this more, about what time is the right time to make certain kinds of art? I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with what he's, with the idea of making art at a time of war. But I think that the question is, what is the art that you're trying to make, trying to say? And is it something that is relevant to the human condition? Is now the right time to sort of be saying it? And you can argue that anything can be said at any point in time, but the reality of the situation, at least to me, is that you can say whatever you want whenever you want, but people won't be receptive to it necessarily at all times. And I think that there's a lot more that you can go down into that based on or that the book could have interrogated more. But I also think that like some of the things that I wish that the book did more are probably things that would have made it limited to a lot of people, that would have limited its audience, that would have made it a little bit too deep or a little bit too complex. And I think that, for like, not necessarily a book club read, but maybe a book club read, or a friend group or something, like, it's not a bad book for what it is. I just wish that it had done more. I think that there's a lot more that it could have done. It touched on and raised some interesting points, but it also dropped the ball in other ways. It succeeded very much in some of its portrayals, but it felt that other portrayals felt lacking. So I enjoyed the book. I'm glad to see a book like this get popular and get recognition, particularly in, again, talking about when is the right time to write art, or in this case, when is an extremely fortuitous time to release that art. It's all sort of tied together, And I'm glad to see this book get the recognition that it deserves. I think that I already said that it deserves. I think it's the recognition is decently deserved, and I wish it had done a little bit more. So join me next time when I talk about, I don't know, everything in my life right now is an absolute clusterfuck and a mess. So I have no idea. So see you then.